Good morning, dear colleagues. It's my pleasure to welcome you for the very first time in 2023. Today is the 5th of January 2023. So happy New Year to all of you who are listening to this. It's a pleasure that you are still here. I'm very grateful that you are still here. And I wish you all the best for the upcoming month and years. All the best. It's my pleasure to introduce Ingvild Bode today to you. Ingvild is of German origin with a very international career track, including inter alia, the University of Tokyo in Japan. And she is currently an associate professor of international relations at the University of Southern Denmark. And she's also the principal investigator of an ERC research grant on autonomous weapon systems. So just for those people, for the very few who are not that familiar with academia in Europe, ERC grants are the most prestigious and most competitive grants to be earned on all career stages, and it's really an outstanding achievement to get such a funding. Because it's very, very competitive, and it's very, very, and the entry point to get it is that you are doing something which is groundbreaking. This is the precondition to be successful here. And as I said, she's a principal investigator in such an ERC grant, which means that she mastered this competition and works on the field in the domain that we are dealing with, which is autonomous weapon systems and international norms. The ERC grants acronym is AutoNorms, if you want to Google this. Her research agenda, not surprisingly, covers the area of peace and security, with a theoretical focus combining practice theories and constructivist international relations. And she's interested in analyzing processing of policy and normative change, in particular in the areas of weaponized artificial intelligence, the use of force, United Nations peacekeeping, and more general dynamics of the UN Security Council. I came across her work because she's also giving interviews, and I read one of the interviews in the German computer science journal ZT, where she was quite intensely quoted with some of her research points. And just to share this also very shortly with you, you will find on her website quite some further literature on the topic we will deal with, including a book that you can buy that she co-authored. And that was published, but you don't need to buy it because it's also open access, available in the preprint version on the website. And she's also recently still very active in the domain. This is the last publication that I found and that I read with a lot of interest, and also with a lot of additional information coming from 2023 on autonomous drones. I think that I don't really need to explain why this topic is of urgent importance. It was not today, but it was possibly not that clear when you, Ingvild, started to work in the domain. So perhaps you might share with us why you started with this, when you started with it, and how you would define the topic you're dealing with here.
Yes, thank you so much, Nicholas, for your kind invitation and for this very generous introduction to my work and my person. I really appreciate it. So I actually came to this topic through having looked at drones in the past, but not autonomous drones, which is kind of drones such as the Predator and the Reaper, as they had been used in the US war on terror. But kind of that kind of looking at drones and the legal issues surrounding drones, especially with regard to the use of force, then kind of connected really well to these kind of new technologies emerging in this space that have begun to integrate artificial intelligence, also autonomy or automation into warfare. And so coming from this, that kind of led to this kind of wider research focus that I have now on really kind of, on the one hand, kind of tracking empirically what kind of developments we can see in these weapon systems with autonomous features, but then also kind of what kind of challenges this poses for international law as it stands today, but also international norms. So I should say that I know that there may be a lot of legal listeners to this podcast or to this stream. So I'm actually a political scientist by training. So my understanding of norms goes a bit beyond the legal understanding of norms to also capture kind of social norms about basically how states think about what are appropriate ways of using force that are, of course, always connected to the legal framework. But in the case of, for example, autonomous weapon systems, the connection is maybe looser than in other cases because there's no specific international law governing this space at the moment. Of course, there's always generally applicable international law governing this space or these weapon systems also, but there's nothing really specific, which kind of for me was all of the starting points for my research, really.
Yeah, so that's already a very, very relevant starting point, obviously, because the understanding what exactly a norm is one of the fundamental questions when it comes to law and to legal studies. And my rather naive first question would be: are there any norms in the broadest sense you can use the term when it comes to AI and use of AI for warfare? Because my feeling as a layperson is that there is not too much what is not. I mean, everything as usual. What is technically possible will be done. Period. Or am I missing something here? And if so, what am I missing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two basic perspectives you can take on norms or how norms emerge, right? So there's kind of a top-down perspective where something is set in after having been discussed or deliberated by states in usually international forums, right? Or also, of course, nationally, but my focus is really on the international level. So where you would have maybe a UN treaty or something of the kind, and then the kind of that sets top-down in the national norm, and then that would then shape potentially and hopefully state behavior, right? But which in this space we don't have this, right? But I think, and this is all kind of the argument that I put forward in my ERC project, that this is not the only way that norms emerge, but we can also see norms in the social sense, in the sense of kind of understandings of appropriateness emerging in practices. So in what kind of states do. And here I'm invested in understanding to what extent practices of how states develop weaponized AI or AI in warfare, and to what extent they use it then. So how this is shaping norms in this kind of social understanding of the term. So so that for me, a norm in that sense. Maybe I should also say that. So I always think of norms as having kind of a dual quality. So there's this element of kind of ordinance and justice or morality to a norm, but then there's also an element that comes from kind of more kind of critical literature from Foucault, for example, who argues that norms are also kind of normalizing, right? So they distinguish between kind of normal types of behavior and abnormal types of behavior. And here I think that in the process of states basically using and designing these weapon systems that kind of work in a specific way, and they basically set norms in a sense in these practices. And just to give you a bit of a better illustration for that, for example, one of the big debates is the extent to which humans can remain in control of using force when we think about AI in warfare, especially in weapon systems. And there I think that this trajectory of how states have designed and used these weapon systems with autonomous features, that all of them still kind of include quite often a human in the loop, or a human kind of who has to authorize the release of force. But at the same time, the role of that human is actually maybe not of such a high quality, right? And I basically think that this is basically a norm in this space, So there is a certain diminished quality of human control over the use of force that comes out of these practices of how states have been developing and using these weapon systems, and this is kind of setting standards of appropriate behavior in this space.
Mm-hmm. Well, my question here would be whether this is because states think that there are some norms regulating what they are doing, or whether there are state interests leading into a specific direction, limiting the usability of such weapons because the risks, for example, are too high to use them in a completely autonomous way. And one of my points that made me think about that more in detail was that I came across an article, and as I said, I have completely no idea whether this is appropriate, but still I came across an article arguing that there is quite a lot of research funding available at the moment in the US and in China, thinking about in how far it would be appropriate to let AI decide on the usage of nuclear weapons, because these scenarios that are described in this article lead into the direction that at the very end, the president might not be in the US now. The president might not be in the position to decide on whether or not to push the button for whatever reason, complexity of the situation, time, whatever. And that then it might be more appropriate to let an AI system decide. And if that were true, right, if it were true that there is research funding available for a scenario in which the decision on the usage of nuclear weapons is based on AI, then I would not see too much of norms limiting the usage of AI at all, apart from is it technically feasible and are the risks to be controlled?
I mean, I think you point to an interesting dilemma here, right? So, which is the norms that I talked about just now, are not necessarily limiting, but actually quite permissive, right? And unless we have kind of a different norm setting process that maybe comes from a top-down level, right? Then this is the kind of the norms that we have at the moment. But as you are saying, they're actually not limiting the usage of these technologies in warfare. They're actually enabling them, right? And yeah, if we go to the very kind of end of the spectrum, which is where I would locate the scenario that you just described, so an usage of nuclear weapons. I mean, this is by far not accepted, but I mean, in a way, it also falls into the spectrum of what is talked about by states who are investing heavily in these technologies, such as the US and China, as you just mentioned, because in the way the kind of the strategic impetus from a military perspective for these technologies always is that the kind of that everything will operate at machine speed, right? And if that is kind of your assumption in a scenario where the competitor that you are engaging with is also a great power, so like in a US-China potential war, which we hopefully, of course, does not happen, but which is very much in the minds of these thinkers, these military strategists. Then of course the assumption is that the other side would also have the same technologies, right? And then you quite quickly, I think, end up in a scenario where everything is kind of determined by that context rather than normative frameworks, which at the moment are, as I said, not that more permissive than prohibitive either.
So if you're saying that they are more permissive than prohibitive, is this, I mean, question to you now about your understanding of your research, is this the final point to make, or is there an additional point to make, which is to become normative and to suggest something which leads probably more into limitations of such systems? Where would you define the point of no return for your own research?
So I mean, I think I'm very interested in kind of first of all, kind of tracking these processes of how the current practices are making the norms that we have quite permissive, but then also to see how does that interact with how these systems actually debated upon, right? And as many of the listeners or you also will know, there has been a long debate about potentially regulating or governing autonomous weapon systems at the UN in Geneva, so at the UN Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. So since 2017, there's been a group of governmental experts on emerging technologies in the area of laws, that's your official title, where states parties are basically discussing whether new international law is needed in this space, right, to actually set firm legal limits, right, about what is permissible and what is prohibited, right? And I would say that this is definitely needed. I mean, there are problems with this forum that we can talk about maybe in a bit. But what I am particularly interested in looking at this forum, I have been kind of observing these debates since 2017 when the GGE started in the first place. So what I'm interested in is to what extent do states actually reflect on their own practices, of using some of these weapon systems already, and what they do in terms of setting norms, right? And unfortunately, quite often they do not reflect on these practices, because I think there's a big kind of push towards kind of maybe potentially regulating really fully autonomous weapon systems. So these would be systems that are completely outside of human control, right? So that would make these decisions completely outside of any human intervention. And I think most states are not in favor of that, right? But there are a lot of kind of systems in the gray zone towards this kind of full autonomy, that kind of integrate various forms of autonomy, OAI, and targeting, and most of the states appear to be less concerned with these systems, right? But I think actually that that this is a problem, right? So because these are the systems, or the practices surrounding these systems are what kind of sets this permissive normative environment. And if you don't engage with that, and you don't also try to regulate these kinds of systems in some shape or form, then you will end up with kind of two types of systems, right? So one that will be permitted, which is the vast majority of the systems, and then maybe one at the very fine end that will be prohibited, which I think is maybe not it's not enough to shape really or to set kind of clear normative or legal boundaries in this space.
Yeah, there is. I mean, it's interesting that you used the future tense now. There will be, as if this were in the future, and at the same time, we are talking about political debates that have been happening now for many years, and also on a very formal level now for many years.
Yeah.
However, not with too much outcome yet, at least not too much hard law outcome, also on international law standards, hard law outcome. And my question is now whether there is not a risk that we are simply being so late with everything which comes from a regulatory perspective, that the technological development has developed so far that there is no point of return available any longer. Would you share that fear?
I mean, I think precisely. I mean, I think there is always a point of return, right? So if we look at previous processes where weapon systems have been regulated and prohibited, some of the cases like chemical or biological weapons, for example, right? So of course these had been used in the First World War already, and then the convention to regulate these weapon systems was only kind of ratified and agreed upon in the 90s, right? So of course there was quite a long time of when different practices in terms of how these weapon systems were used, developed. But then there was still the possibility to kind of set new legal rules. And now, of course, we're in a situation where there are kind of small incidents of states using chemical or biological weapons, more or less, they are not used, right? So I mean, it's a very effective legal regime, actually. So I just think just because something is already out there and is being used, that doesn't necessarily mean that it can't be regulated, right? But I definitely share your concern that it's important to get a move on, right? And I use kind of the future tense because because one of my observations in kind of monitoring this debate is that a lot of states parties are talking about these systems as if they are a future concern, so as if because there's always this kind of this strange terminology, so that if you define autonomous weapon systems as a system that works without any human intervention, then I think at the moment there are systems that would meet this requirement, right? But there's the political decision to always have a human in the loop, right? Who in the end authorizes force. But that is a political decision rather than it being a technical necessity, right? But for some reason, right? So the problem is always kind of pushed towards the future by many states parties, which I think is the real problem, right? Because it doesn't allow us to actually look at what is happening right now and how that is problematic, in terms of its trajectory.
Yeah. So let's perhaps, if I may suggest, so let's have a closer look into what's happening right now in Geneva and on a technological level as well. I mean, if we already mentioned obviously the US and China, and both of us are Europeans, so one of the concerns that probably Europeans have here is that the technological development happens so clearly outside Europe that Europe is more and more losing track here, and at the same time that the two main players on a global level, the US and China, are not really to be regulated by anything that is coming out of Geneva. So again, would that be a justifiable concern, both points, Europe and non-regulation of China/US?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a concern. It has to be said that, of course, the US and China have by far the biggest investment in technologies in this space. to some extent also Russia, although there are bigger question marks here, right, about the extent to which this can continue to hold true under the sanctions regime, and also in terms of what we've seen in Ukraine, whether the kind of the big promises about Russian modernization of its armed forces, have actually been realized by Russia, So
Yeah.
so
You
it's
wrote
less
on
clear.
this extensively. I read this article, and I will come back to Russia in a minute.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Let's bracket Russia for the moment.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what is quite interesting that, of course, because many European states are, of course, in part members of NATO, and are also therefore in a very close defense collaboration with the US. So first of all, they will certainly encounter these systems, that the US is developing or already encountering them, right? And some of the states in Europe are also interested themselves, right, in developing these technologies, although not at the same scale as the US and China in terms of financial investment, But if you look at the UK, for example, they have really prioritized the development of AI in warfare as part of their new security strategy. And then countries such as France, Netherlands, Sweden, and also Turkey, for example, appear to be very favorably inclined to developments in this area and also have investments attached to them, right? I think there are kind of that there are kind of two ways of seeing this. So Europe is not necessarily opposed to that, but it's also kind of part of it to some in a certain extent, and to a lesser extent than the US, but also in collaboration with the US. And then the second point that you were asking about, whether a regulation that does not include the big developers will be efficient, right, or will be effective in governing the space. I think that is a real concern, of course, right? And if we look at what these states, China and the US, have been saying in Geneva, they don't seem to be very committed to having, of course, a firm regulation of autonomous weapon systems. But at the same time, I think there is a value to setting an international legal norm prohibiting certain types of autonomous weapon systems, regulating others, even if the big developers are not part of that norm, right? Because I think we have seen in for example, the other cases such as the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, right? That of course that treaty is also not adhered to or signed, right, by any of the big developers or users of nuclear weapons. But at the same time, it kind of sets a certain legal principle, right, that really quite clearly legitimizes these systems, right, and that has normative repercussions, right, especially over time. So I think there's a normative value, right, to having a legal treaty governing the space even without the developers of these systems.
I see. And so then let's come back to what could be regulated in such a treaty. And if I understand your point, one of the points that you made so far correctly, you said that there is some kind of consensus that at the end it should be a human deciding on whether or not to use a certain weapon system. And my question is now, in how far that can be properly put into a legal term, because I think the whole history of warfare shows that the more technologically advanced a system is, the more can happen between the decision of a human to use a certain instrument and the outcome, right? So if I use a knife, it's quite clear I'm taking the decision, and it's quite clear what's going to happen. If I'm using a machine gun, it's already very, very different. And if I'm using a drone that is flying independently, it's even more unclear, and so on. So where exact is there a limit or a point to make where humans need to be in the position to decide, and how could that be put into a legal text?
Yeah, I think if you look at how the discussion in Geneva have evolved over the past couple of years, there's been quite a lot of more sophistication in kind of understanding exactly these kind of touch points, right, or spaces for human control. And there are publications, for example, by the UN Institute for Disarmament Research, that kind of look at various different phases in the military operation or the planning of a military operation where human control can be involved, right? So it's not just I think at the beginning, the focus was very much on the fine end, right? So in really specific use of force situations, right? So is there a human kind of more or less pressing the button, right? Or deciding about is force used or not, in a particular situation. But if we look at autonomous weapon systems or AI in warfare, we have to start a lot earlier than that. So I think the specific use of force is very important, but then you have to go back to how are, of course, the targeting algorithms programmed in the first place, right? So, which is also a space where, of course, human control can be exercised, because these algorithms are developed and programmed by coders and by humans, right? And military and civilian decision makers kind of set the basic parameters under which these algorithms are supposed to function. So I think we should think about human control at different stages of a life cycle of a weapon, right? Because if you just stick to one stage, I think it might not be enough, right? To if you want to ensure human control, to make sure that it actually happens. I think in terms of how this could be put in legal language, I'm not the right person, I think, to ask. I think I mean, I think generally in terms of how I understand many of the principles of international humanitarian law, even if you try to be as precise as possible, there will always be a certain kind of leeway for ambiguity. And I guess that is also because many, of course, of these legal texts or these treaty texts are the outcome of, in the end, kind of diplomatic negotiations. So they, in order for states to kind of sign up to particular treaties, right? So they always kind of, I think that there always kind of spaces of or issues that have to be resolved maybe in the implementation stage, right? So, but I think even if we would have kind of an abstract or potentially ambiguous formulation or principle that guarantees human control as a positive obligation, that would still be better than what we have now, which is basically no specific regulation in this space. Yeah, and there are very sophisticated proposals put forward, for example, by the International Committee of the Red Cross, to kind of and they kind of suggest a two-step approach to governing autonomous weapon systems, which would prohibit certain types of autonomous weapon systems that are unpredictable or that target human beings. And then I propose to regulate other types of autonomous weapon systems by kind of limiting types of targets, by limiting how long the system can be active, situations of use, but also by clearly kind of setting requirements for human control in these systems that are to be regulated rather than prohibited, And I think that this kind of two-step approach seems to be gaining momentum at the GGE. So I think many states parties seem to be in favor of this approach. The question then just is whether something will be decided in the GGE forum, because that forum operates by consensus, which is an obvious problem if you have states such as Russia, but also such as the US, who are actually opposed to a legal regulation in the space. But of course, that could be solved by kind of maybe potentially moving to a different forum that is not bound by consensus, right? But where states could then kind of negotiate such a text without this consensus requirement.
Yeah. I mean, you rightly mentioned that public international law is full of ambiguities. The same is very true for my domain, which is IT law, and in particular when it comes already to definitions of what AI would really be. There is, of course, no consensus on this, and therefore also the legal definitions are very, very ambiguous and heavily debated. And we have two fields now with all these kinds of uncertainties and ambiguities merged in the issues we're dealing with, and that multiplies, of course, the complexity. So, and I also found it very interesting that you said it might be more appropriate to start with regulating the development by regulating the algorithms. The question that I have then is AI or are drones that different from any other weapon then? And shouldn't there be some kind of a general consensus then on how computing should happen when it comes to use in warfare? That's my first question. And the second one comes with the first one, which is, I think there's plenty of unknown unknowns in the domain, because nobody openly discusses what is developed somewhere for military purposes internally, not even in Europe and not even in European research, because as both of us know, there are all kinds of secrecies and hidden and officially not shared informations that are outcomes of research projects even in Europe. And so how should that ever happen if nobody knows what the other one is doing, and if you do not even know that you don't know what the other one is doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think to your first question, I completely agree, right? So I think
Mm,
there's a lot of overlap, right, across different different weapon technologies, that have to do with the kind of computer assisted um, decision support in warfare, basically, right? So, and
yeah.
this covers a manner of different technologies, and I think it's quite interesting that at the moment the discussion has only been focused on weapon systems, but of course AI is used in various different ways. Not only in weapon systems, right, but
Mm,
also for decision support, right, and kind of at earlier stages of decision making, when the weapon is not in the picture already, right, and that also kind of we've already seen these practices with regard to drones, as you were saying, right. So I mean, there have been this famous kind of investigative reports, kind of demonstrating how terrorist suspects made it onto kill lists on the basis of what kind of information the US, for
mm,
example, has been targeting terrorist suspects, right? So I think there was this famous quote that the US targets people on the basis of metadata, right? And in a way, this is kind of the same. This is part of the same conversation.
yeah.
And the problem that I see with how the discussion is kind of emerging at the moment, that these things are very compartmentalized, and you
Mm,
might kind of regulate the fine end of the spectrum, but not the kind of the full spectrum of it,
mm,
And so I
mm,
absolutely agree with you that there should be a much broader discussion of these issues.
mm,
And in terms of the kind of what is known and what can we know, I think it is a major research problem, especially if
mhm,
you're a civilian researcher. So
yeah.
which I think why many of my colleagues in this space kind of have some kind of military background, right, or attached to military institutions, and which then gives them different kinds of access, right, to actually finding out what these technologies are capable of. As one of the parts of the ERC project I'm running, we're trying to kind of put together what we call qualitative data catalogs
Mhm,
that kind of try to first of all give an map what is actually there in terms of systems using autonomous or AI-based features, So and
mm,
we looked at kind of different domains. I mean, we're actually working at the moment on a longer data catalog on loitering munition, which is a type of drone integrating AI functions.
mm,
Um, but you quickly see that what is available to you as a kind of in kind of open access data is I mean in some sense, in some cases it's quite a lot, because these systems have become much more prominent, especially in the case and since the Ukraine war started, right? So there's a lot more information published about these systems, and also more interviews that journalists have conducted with weapon manufacturers. So you're getting more information, but still you always have to rely on what the weapon manufacturers are providing you with, right?
mhm. And they have an
So
interest, of course. I mean, they have commercial interest to try to sell a product, right? So there is an information bias in this from the very beginning.
exactly. and
Mm,
and and they are also changing their narratives actually,
mm,
so there's this one prominent case about one of these systems, the STM, so a Turkish manufacturer, Cargo 2, so which was addressed in a UN report on Libya in 2021. So that report called that system a lethal autonomous weapon system, and said it was used completely autonomously in Libya. And the manufacturer, before that kind of report was published, was actually advertising its system as kind of having AI features and kind of facial recognition, right, and
mhm,
being capable of autonomous targeting. After the report was published, suddenly it said, no, this system is always run with a human in the loop. So there's always a human in control, right? It's fully in adherence with the human in the loop principle,
mhm.
which was very different to what they were publishing before. But then it's very, I mean, so as a member of the general public, or even as an academic researcher, there's no way of knowing what that system is actually capable of doing technologically, right? Unless you will be able to study it.
Yeah, and there's all kind of legal marketing happening here because it doesn't come with any cost to claim that something meets a legal or an ethical requirement if you don't need to prove it, right? And if there's no autonomous authority checking
Yeah,
this and assessing it and challenging it, right? And I mean, I find it very interesting, honestly, also from a research funding perspective on a European level, and this goes back now probably to your ESC grant
yeah,
history track here, that in some areas of European research funding, it's absolutely normal and it's even requested that information that is produced within the project remains confidential and is restricted for security reasons. And that makes it very difficult, of course, also from an individual research point of view, what to do in such cases. I mean, you mentioned already that it's very difficult to get public information, but there is another point here, which is in how far are you accepting that you get access to confidential information by accepting the rule that you may not share this? I mean, do you consider this as an I mean, how do you deal with this from your own research perspective? Because I'm trying to learn something for mine. So how do you handle this?
I think it's a major problem. It's a major
Yeah.
problem because even if you conduct expert interviews in this space, formally, right, the ERC is very invested in these kind of consent procedures. So their preferred solution is that you get written consent from any research participant, right?
Yeah.
But that, if we're talking about a very politically sensitive topic such as this one, this is not possible, right? Especially if you're conducting, for example, so parts of my research team, if I was be conducting interviews in China, there's no way, right? That somebody in China will sign something as an informed consent and have their name attached to that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so
It's
what we do
completely
is
absurd,
basically,
unthinkable, right? I mean,
yeah. And that is even, and that's not even a Chinese problem, you know. So even if you go to the Austrian Ministry of Defense, say, right, and ask somebody like a military expert, you know, to the interview, I think they would agree, but they would never agree to sign something and have their name attached to it, right? So I think that's a problem, and so the only way that I have actually been able to get most of the interviews that I conducted was that the agreement was not even that I could use any quotes from this in public publications, but just that it would be a background only conversation, right? So which then means basically it can inform my understanding, you know, but I cannot work with this in any publication, you know, which I think is it's kind of frustrating, but I still think, of course, it kind of allows me to kind of look at the sources that are open and published in a different way on the basis of this information, you know, and that allows me to kind of bring a new kind of strains of thought that I would otherwise not have had, right? Okay, I look at other ways, and sometimes it's also interesting that while some things are quite hard to access, I think there is actually a lot of information about some other things, you know, that you could that you can track, you know, and kind of, if you know where to look, you know. So sometimes it's also about these military experts, for example, providing me with kind of just kind of information about sources that are publicly available, but that we as civilian researchers would not necessarily look for, right? And kind of some more diffuse kind of military journals, for example, right, or kind of military publications. What I think is a bit frustrating that on the one hand, right, the EU of course funds, as you were saying, these projects that have that are not supposed to publish their findings, right? But then as a normal ERC grantee, you're supposed to publish everything. Everything has to be open access, right? So so there's a strong requirement that the EU has that everything is kind of accessible to a wide variety of audience members, right? So there's kind of a different systems in place, I suppose.
Yeah, and also different values here and conflicting values, because at the very moment, in the moment, you would find something in your ERC grant which has a strategic security interest, and would be from a security point of view something to be restricted. It would be very interesting to see what's going to happen then, right? I mean, I don't know whether there is a case on this, but I know that there's plenty of restricted deliverables in European research projects out there. For the very reason that there is a security interest or a security risk coming with them, at least in the judgment of somebody who is deciding on the funding, right? So
yeah.
Yeah,
no,
again,
absolutely. I think maybe in my case, I have not been running into this particular difficulty because I don't look at any EU member states, right? So my focus is on the kind of the big developers of military AI, which are kind of China, Russia, and the US, and then also looking at Japan, you know. So I guess if
but
I would
that's
be having
perhaps already the problem. Sorry to intervene here,
no,
but
of
that's
course.
perhaps already the problem, because as you rightly mentioned at the very beginning, there are some European countries also trying to get a grip on this. And at the same time, Europe is number one in claiming we are the ones to regulate AI. I mean, this is one of the big political promises coming with this commission, outside, of course, military, because unfortunately this whole regulation explicitly does not cover military purposes, right? But the risk coming with this is that people like you don't look into Europe and you don't run into this security problem, and people like me dealing with the AI regulation don't run into the problem because it's not about military, and there is probably happen quite a lot also in Europe that is neither covered by people like you nor by people like me.
Yeah, you know what? I mean, I think that kind of has to do a bit with when I started writing this grant proposal. I mean, the grant itself started in 2020, but wrote the proposal in 2018. So it's quite some time ago, right? So, and at that time, European Union member states were not that invested in this sphere. Now it has changed completely, you know, and now, of course, with the Ukraine war, it's changing even more,
Yeah.
as you rightly point out, you know. So I think so I've had kind of one piece that I wrote with a colleague of mine where we try to look at specifically what the EU is actually doing in terms of trying to regulate military AI. But I think also here it's much more ambiguous than what it is trying to do in the civilian sphere.
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, there are some attempts that are kind of maybe less ambitious, right, than the EU AI Act. So, for example, the European Parliament, right, so has been putting forward two different kinds of resolutions where they also try to intervene in this debate on autonomous weapon systems and kind of try to put themselves very firmly on the side that kind of says we need legal regulations, we need to maintain human control. But then, of course, there are the kind of efforts that the EU is engaging with in with regard to the European Defence Fund, right? That include also some stipulations about laws, you know. So it says it prohibits funding for the development of autonomous weapon systems that would be able to function without the possibility for meaningful human control over the selection and engagement decisions when carrying out strikes. But that reservation kind of is is in a way qualified, right? Because it mentions also that EDF funds could be used for development of kind of early warning systems or for all kinds of other kind of military AI systems that don't fit within this kind of specific qualification, right? So yeah, so I think it's quite interesting. So on the one hand, I think the EU tries to also be a bit of a rule maker in
Yeah.
military AI, but not as clearly as in the civilian sphere. And on the other hand, it also has this kind of strategic interest, right, in developing these technologies. And also this is also it puts that quite openly, right? So that's this is a major source of innovation, and I think they don't want to kind of engage in too much of a prohibitive regulatory frame, you know, that would then maybe come back to bite them, you know. Although I think, of course, it would still be possible from a EU perspective.
Yeah. Um, Absolutely. And I mean, I just one last remark on this. I think in the civil area, at least when it
Yeah.
comes to policing and civil security, we see quite a similar tendency, which is that there is all kind of open research happening, constantly claiming that we need more or that there is a lack of regulation and that developments are happening outside Europe, and we need to catch up with developing those systems and to regulating them. And at the same time, there is a hidden corpus of developments within Europe that are so complex and so difficult to identify that there is already all kinds of AI security related practices happening within Europe without anyone really covering it ethically, legally, and also technically, because it's so covered. It's so difficult to identify. And I assume that it's even worse when it comes to military, right? And
Yeah.
that's the hypothesis that I'm trying to share here.
Yeah.
But let's perhaps come back to Russia, because as you said, when you started with this in 2018, the landscape looked very different from today, technologically and also politically. And I would really love to hear a little bit more about what you extensively wrote about how Russia changes your and the war in Ukraine, of course, changes your perspective on the matter. Just to remind those of you who did not read the text, Putin was very, very aggressively, I would even say, argue prior to the war how important the development of AI systems for military purposes would be. And what we see, if I'm not mistaken, is a relatively low impact so far of these systems on the day-to-day routines in the war. So perhaps you could help us in understanding what's going on there.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of these big kind of surprises in a way, right? So that for a long time, Russia had been advertising very heavily its investments in military AI in all kinds of weapon systems that would include AI or even neural networks, right? So various Russian military actors, such as the Kalashnikov complex, for example, putting forward these promotional materials, more or less, right, about all kinds of weapon systems that would be intelligent, right, or include AI. So some of the listeners might have heard about the Uran 9 tank, right? So the autonomous tank that was quite heavily in the news. And then when the Ukraine war started, we actually didn't see many of these systems or any of these systems at all. There are some of the systems, the few systems that Russia has used that include some kind of AI or autonomy are these loitering munitions, you know. So a loitering munition is more or less it's also kind of called a suicide drone or killer drone in kind of in the coverage on the war. So we're basically talking about a system that is a bit of a mixture between a drone and a missile, in the sense that that kind of they like a missile, sorry, not like a missile. They're actually not fired on a specific target, but they loiter over the battlefield in a particular, or a potentially quite broad geographical area, trying to look for a particular class of target that they identify via sensors or kind of object recognition. And once they have kind of identified their target, they launch themselves onto it and destroy the target and themselves in the process. So that's why this kind of suicide drone terminology comes from. But quite often, many of these systems still have a kind of a human in the loop. So a human is kind of authorizing the use of force decision. And Russia has a couple of these loitering munition systems that it has been developing domestically and it has used in Ukraine in the kind of the earlier phase of the war, kind of March, April, to no great effect, it has to be said, right? So it was, I mean, it's very clear, it's very unclear sometimes trying to piece together from open source data which of the systems is responsible for destroying what, right? Because there's so many of these kind of different drones or also guided missiles involved in the war. But I think it's more or less clear that these systems were not very effective. The only thing then that has been kind of popping up again in this area was the use of Iranian Shahed 136s starting in the autumn of last year, which is also a type of loitering munition, but doesn't really have any significant AI capacities, really, right? So which basically means, right, so that AI in terms of weapon systems has not really played a role on the Russian side in the war, right? So, but the whole war effort has looked far more conventional than I think many of the observers were kind of expecting to see, right? And in the initial phase of the war, I think there was always this kind of uncertainty. Are they holding these systems back? You know, will they be used at any point in the futures? Now it just seems that they don't have the systems, or they're not operational or effective to the degree that they would be used, right? So I think it also tells us something. This is something that my colleague Anna Nadi-Baitze, who in my ERC project is really dealing specifically with the Russia case, because she also can read Russian, you know, which I can't, you know. So I'm really relying on her expertise for these framings. But I think there's this kind of interesting dynamic between Russia kind of clearly overselling, right? Or what they're kind of technologically capable of in terms of their military and what they actually are capable of, right? And then it's kind of interesting how this dynamic has led to a point where this also has become accepted, right? I mean, I think there's kind of a very often quoted off-the-cuff remark that Putin gave a couple of years back, kind of saying that whoever rules AI will rule the world, right? So this is, I mean, I think it has been circulating in so many news reports, right? And it has been so intense, this kind of discussion, also threatening scenario, you know. And I don't want to say, of course, that that there are not military lessons to be drawn from that, but I mean, in the specific area of military AI, we can definitely say that the expectations were overblown, right?
Yeah, which brings me again back to this information bias issue that we had before. Could it be that this is true not only for Russia?
Yeah, I mean, which it makes you think, certainly,
Yeah.
doesn't it, right?
Yeah.
Because in terms of China, right, what is actually publicly available about what China is developing in this tech space is also limited again, right? And it's anyway, it's always a circulation of the same sources that is being used to, on the US side, justify major military investments in AI, right? So we have this kind of dynamic that because the fact that these developments are seen in a certain way is basically used to justify military investment in AI on the other side, right?
Mm.
So the main reason, if you look at US policy documents of why the US is investing, is because it sees China as a strategic competitor, and it doesn't want to kind of fall behind on China, right? Especially in the space of military AI. But if as you, but actually, what is happening in the space of military AI in China is actually not very clear, right? And to what extent this is um, this can be used as a justification to ramp up resources on the Western side, I think is also
Mm.
not clear. But we still run into this in this kind of weird, I would say, a dynamic, right? Where we're making assumptions on the basis of something that is actually not that crystal clear, right? But these are used to justify investment decisions, and in a way, then the investments, and then of course, how is the Chinese side going to react to that? Also more investments, right? In AI and in the military sphere in particular. Yeah, so I think that there is this kind of very very awkward competitive dynamic that is maybe not necessarily even based on facts.
Yeah, and this brings me to a very big picture of this whole podcast series here, and brings me back to what we talked before we started to stream here, which is what is in a way the connecting point of all the things we are covering here. One of the connecting points, I think, is that law traditionally was a field where there were facts, they were quite clear, and then there was plenty of debate about how the law should be applied to the clear facts. What we see now, and I think this is a very, very critical example, what we see now is that the facts are not clear because there is so much uncertainty about the facts everywhere, and still the law still needs to and tries to cover something which is as a phenomenon unclear, and that brings me back again to one of the fundamental questions here, which is what is a norm then, and what could a norm achieve? If in Geneva, not even the question whether any of those systems by anyone is ready to be used is uncertain, how could we then ever come up with something usefully regulating this phenomenon? And what would be, and that perhaps is the more, I mean, we covered this already, I think, but the other part of the question we did not cover, and I would really love to get your answer on that, which is, what is the role of the lawyers then? So what
Yeah.
is exactly the input that someone with a legal background can provide to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a twofold answer to your question, right? And in the first sense, I think you're right. There is a lot of uncertainty about what is actually technologically out there and how can we
Mhm.
know what is out there. But I think it is clear that there is a development trajectory that many of the major investors in military infrastructure are integrating more and more of these automated, autonomous, AI-driven features into weapon systems. Full stop.
Yeah,
There is a clear trajectory, right? And we can see that it has been developing since the 50s, right? So this is not a new story. It has intensified because of the technological progress in the field of AI. So we
yeah,
know this, right? So and we also know that there's a dire need for regulating this space because there's no specific regulation, right?
mm,
Um, so I think the task for lawyers is really to clarify this gap, right? So that there is a gap in the law, right?
mm,
So, for example, there's a big debate about whether the law as it stands today even has a requirement for human control in there, right?
mm, mhm,
And some lawyers say it is there, but only implicitly, right? Of course, nowhere does it say in any international humanitarian
mm.
law treaty that a human has to remain in control over the use of force, because that was just not an issue when these treaties were negotiated, right? So it was just outside
Sorry,
of the
Ingvild,
imaginable.
if
Yeah.
I may, I'm not sure whether it's because it was not clear that that could happen. I
Okay.
think it was, and I can give you quite some examples because I would answer because it's not clear what the winning value here would be.
Mm.
So there is so much debate, for example, in the civil area, in how
Hmm.
far automated decision making should be legitimate or not. And we have a
Yeah.
very nice article in GDPR dealing with this. And when you look into it from a first point of view, you would say, okay, there is a clear statement. There is no such thing like legitimate automated decision making. And you can even connect this with human dignity if you want to, this requirement. But at the same time, when you look into section 2 of the very same article, there are exceptions from this, right? And one of the exceptions is that there is a law clearly stating on a national or on a European level that it might be the case that automated decision making might be legitimate. And we see a very similar tendency in the AI Act, in my view, because there is again a very easy statement, which is no such thing like unacceptable risk real-time AI-based video surveillance of people. And then you get 4 sections of exceptions from this article. One of them, I don't know, a child abuse or terrorism, or you name it, and suddenly this erodes. And I would assume that quite the same issue is here. That the case. So I'm not that certain that it's about we don't know what's going to happen. It's more about we don't know what we should do if it's a hard case.
Yeah. No, I appreciate you saying that. I think I was kind of more thinking about the 70s, right? So when the Geneva Protocols were negotiated, right? So that this was not on people's minds necessarily, right? The question of human control. And I mean, it's very, of course, relevant to look at what is being negotiated now, right? And in terms of the principles and the exceptions to it. But we're not even there in the space of military AI, right? So but I think that there is this kind of open debate, right, about what the law actually says about it now, right, as it stands. And some lawyers kind of argue that if you want to adhere to principles such as proportionality, such as distinction, right, that they necessitate kind of some kind of context-specific human judgment, right? So compliance with them necessitates that, and other people say it doesn't necessitate that, because if an AI could do this as well as a human or better, then we might not need the human, right, to decide upon that. So I guess these questions are the same, right? But I think that there is definitely the need to kind of to clarify that, right? And for me, there's definitely the need to also safeguard, right, human control over the use of force, because we're talking here I mean, this is the most extreme form, right, of relinquishing. I think human control that we can think of, So I think it's just as problematic in other contexts, But here we're talking about life or death decisions, right? So I think for me that is the role of the lawyers, right? And I'm not a lawyer, but I'm certainly talking to people who are lawyers in this space, to really try to formulate this in such a way that at least it's kind of set there as a principle, even though it might be an abstract or vague principle.
May I just react and slowly closing this by the following rather personal remark? Please excuse me for this. I think I mean one of the this is the typical request people with a non-legal background are putting towards a lawyer, right? So there is so much uncertainty out there. It's so complicated. Please give us a precise and justifiable one answer on your issue and on our issue. And the frustrating part for the lawyer is there is no such thing like one answer. I don't think that this will ever be clarified, for the very fact that, as I said, hard cases are not decided yet, and the one finally giving the final answer would be a court, and courts are not yet dealing with these issues. So also no lawyer will ever come up with the one and very last final question, the one and very last final answer to this. Ingvild, I lost you now, probably because the internet connection disappeared, which is a pity, because I would have asked you to wrap up what we have been talking about. But as you disappeared now, I will do this. I really appreciated your input on this matter. It was really, really great. Thank you to all of you who listened to this. I wish you once again a wonderful 2023. Take care and all the best, and hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.